Good evening, good Chodesh. We're learning a Maamar. We've learned this Maamar many times, and it's still a very difficult Maamar. Let me bring up the text. Okay. Okay, so we're learning the Maamar in Torah Or. There's two Maamarim. The first one is the main one. The second is the longer one. The second one is quite short. The Maamar is on the pasuk by the redemption. It says "Be'etzam hayom hazeh," meaning the essence of the day. It says "Be'etzam hayom hazeh yatzu kol tzivos Hashem eretz Mitzrayim kol yatzu kol tzivos Hashem eretz Mitzrayim." All the hosts, or the army of God, so to say, left Egypt. It's Amar Azal. Again, Sharon, we learned this Maamar many times, but it's a difficult Maamar. Amar Azal, our rabbis have taught us, Al Chana, on Chana, again, the mother of Samuel, Shmuel the prophet. So it says about Chana, the prayer of Chana, we read about it on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. It's the beginning of the book of Shmuel, of Samuel, from the time God created the world, no one used the name Tzevaos, what we know as hosts, Lord of hosts, until Chana used the name. She is the first to use the term in her prayer in Shmuel Aleph, first paragraph, verse 11. She said, Havaya Tzevaka, the Lord of hosts. The God of hosts. And God said in response to Chana using that name, or opening with that name, starting to use that name, that Asid Bein Shalach, in the future, your son, meaning Shmuel, Liftach Benevuah B'Shem Zek, Kasev, will also use a prophecy using Hashem's name, Hashem Tzevakos, like it says later in Shmuel Aleph, chapter 15. Yom Shmuel, and Shmuel says, Koi Amar, so said Hashem Tzevakos Pakadati. So said God, Lord of hosts, God of hosts, Pakadati, I remembered. V'hanaviyim ha'achroinim, and as time went on, throughout the beginning of the first temple into the destruction of the first temple, is Nivu b'Shem Zeh, they use this name more often, Ubefrat, specifically the later prophets, which are Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi, Yosim, Mikulam, they use the name Tzevakos more than any of the other prophets before them. And this all was opened and started by Chana, the mother of Shmuel, of Samuel. But Kaimalan, we've learned in the tractate of Shavuos in the Mishnah, the Tzevakos, hu min Hashem nimchakim. It's an important name. It's one of the names that cannot be erased. We know that there's the names of Hashem, the 7 names that cannot be erased because of their sanctity. Tzevakos is one of them, which means to say that she introduced a sacred name of Hashem, not just a term or a kinoi, a nickname, so to say. To understand the significance of what he did, we have to understand what does it mean that God has names. So we can understand the significance of what Chana did to introduce, so to say, a new name, Hazy. So he said, the Alter Rebbe says like this, and also what is unique about the name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, which is known as the name Havaya, the creator, Al-Shar Shemus, that's surely more special than the rest of the names. We have what are the other names? You have Kel, Elokim, and so we have Havaya. Havaya is from the most significant of the names. And then once we understand what are the names, specifically what is the name of Havaya, then we can understand what Chana was doing and why she chose to add the name Tzevakos. Is Hiniyadua is known. That when we talk about the Muhusei Vatzmusei, meaning to say the Atzmus, the essence of the Ein Sof, of the infinite, blessed be He, who Pashit B'tachas Apshitas, is Pashit means simple, or better put, undefined. B'tachas Apshitas in the most undefined way. Means Pashit means there's no, when you have a definition, it already has a character. God is Pashit without any kind of definition of character or name or title. klal. And it's impossible. It's not possible. When we're referring to the essence, to give God any kind of description. A Torah is like a description, like a person's described by a certain way. You could say height, size, color, sex, job, etc. There's no description for God. He's Pashut. He's beyond any kind of description. Nevertheless, we find that there's descriptions. But Torah, in the Torah itself, with Divrei and Nevi'im and the prophets, with Divrei Razal and the rabbis. Kamoi, for instance, there's a terminology we use for God sometimes: Chacham, wise; Chassid, pious; Rachamon, compassionate. These are descriptions. If God is Pshitus, Pshitus means without any description. Means to say the names are not really touching the essence. Like Yeyitzeben and any other names or kinuyim or nicknames that we give God. Although we give God these titles, He's nevertheless, it doesn't define Him. It's not that it means, and so we have to understand what it means, the name. What does it mean to give God a title if He's beyond it? For instance, you wouldn't call a person who's not a chacham, person who's not smart. Calling him smart or her smart is a misinterpretation, a misrepresentation of who this person is. And you could say that it's up for interpretation, etc., but still. Or if you say someone's tall and not tall, or you say someone's any other kind of description, if it's not true, it's false. So we can't say we're giving God false descriptions. At the same time, we say He's beyond any kind of descriptions. Not because we don't understand the description, but He's actually Pashut. There is no descriptions of God. Because Pshitus means there's no way to define or describe Him, not because we don't know the description, because He's beyond any description. It's not the same thing. When you don't understand something, so therefore you can't explain it, it's different, but doesn't mean it doesn't exist. By God, it's not just that it doesn't exist. It doesn't just mean that we don't understand it. It doesn't exist. He's Pashut Shebipshutim, the simplistic of all simplicities, which has no description. So what does it mean to give God a name then? Or definitely a description of Chacham, Rachman, compassionate. Shachacham Shehia Ma'ale Rishonim B'Nivroim. We know why is that a title of positive when you want to say something special? The highest thing you could say about a person means the Ma'ala HaRishonim, the highest level in creations, is the idea of a person's intellect. Nevertheless, the description of Chacham is like an action. Just like when it comes to God. God says, Kulam v'chachma asisa. That Chachma itself is like an asiyah, an action. Just like you can't compare what a person does in action. In the action itself, you could maybe have a hint of a description of the person who does the action. For instance, an artist or a writer or something else. But really, it's a possibility for a person to do an action, an asiyah, that has no understanding or connection to the essence of who the person is who did that, or the being who did that. An animal could do something, right? You don't know exactly. You could try to study it to see the character and the temperament behind an action. But it's possible to have an action that has no connection to the essence. So like it says about God, Kula Mechach Masisa. If we call God a Chacham, wise, to God, Chacham is like an action. And an action that's totally disconnected. We call Shekem Mechinas Amidos. And if intellect is the highest part of the humans, even surely when we give God descriptions of emotion, the midos, Maamar, like it says clearly, and we say this every Friday night in the Pesach Aliyah, the lav mikol ilain midos ihu klal. God cannot be described and connected to any emotional character. That He's emotionally connected to one direction or versus another direction. He's kind, right? You say God's a kind God. That's a description. He's beyond the description. Kanoid as is known. Again, these are not easy concepts. First of all, it's impossible for us to really grasp what we're saying here because we don't know what it means to be pshitas. What's pshitas? Everyone has character. Everyone is made up of their intellectual and emotional breakdown. So to understand the concept of pshitas is almost really kind of impossible for us to understand. We could say that it exists, but to understand it, and at the same time that to have just a glunk, a jellyfish that has and even jellyfish has character. I'm saying if you see just something, a piece of blubber, this okay, fine, but God's not blubber. He's God. He is a chacham. He is chesed. He is kind. It says from God doesn't come down bad. It means He only does good. So we do give God a description of good and bad. At the same time, we say He's pshitas. So again, these are very difficult concepts to understand, but we're gonna try to understand it from the Maamar. V'afa pikei, Nevertheless, yesh mitzvahs in hatarim. Notwithstanding of saying that God is beyond any description, we find the descriptions. It's there. The prophets say it. They're not saying it falsely. The Torah describes it. Shabo b'Tanakh, we see clearly in the Torah Nevi'im Ksuvim, over Divrei Chazal, and the words of the rabbis. Ta'anol derech Maamar Zal. So what does this mean then? What does it mean that God is beyond description? He's pshitas. Nevertheless, we give him descriptions, and he has names, not just kinuyim. The difference in a kinuy and a shame is a kinuy is kind of like a nickname. When someone acquires a nickname, Speedy Gonzalez, right? So you have like you have a nickname, but it's not your name, but it kind of describes something about you. So therefore, the rabbi said, to try to understand this seemingly contradiction, the rabbis has said that where you find greatness by God means you could say, wow, that's great. Ma Rabba Masach Hashem. God is so great. Great is also connected with chesed. Shamata Moitze, then the same place you're going to find a description of greatness. And it's great in your eyes. It's overwhelmingly great. Nevertheless, there you're going to find Anvenusasai, his humility. He humbles himself to be able to be understood and described as great. He lowers himself to enclose himself into the descriptions of the 10 vessels of Atzilus. What is the vessels? The vessels are the definition of the character. Each vessel has a name. Of one vessel is called Chesed, Chachma, wisdom, Bina, understanding, Das, knowledge. The fourth one is called Chesed, kindness. The fifth one is called Gvura. Sixth is Teves, beauty. Netzach, perseverance, Hoid, acknowledgement. Yisod, connection, Malchus, royalty. And those spheros are when God encloses himself in any and all those spheros, then he gets the descriptions. When he's in the Keli of Chachma, there's wisdom. Bina, understanding. Chesed, kindness. Gvura, reservations. Din, judgment. So God, Shehu Yisbarach Mashmal Atzma, he has to lower himself. Liyos Mislabish Ve'eser Keim Latzilus, and clothe himself in these descriptions, and not just descriptions, but also vessels. Vessels, like a vessel, it holds something. That's the point of a vessel. That's the definition of a vessel. When you learn the laws of Kalim and Mishnayos, when the longest tractates of Mishnayos, over 30 parakim, or 30 parakim of Mishnayos, of Kalim, the fundamental question is it a receptacle or not? That's the basic question. Is it a receptacle to be receptacle of tumah, of impurity? And how can it become pure? How can you change its definition of receptacle? Can it lose its name and get a new name? Can it get reinvented? But a keli, by definition, means it's a receptacle. It holds something. Those are the definitions in the attributes, in the midos of kindness and severity. And like we said before, the first three, which are intellectual, chachma bina das, wisdom, knowledge, understanding, and knowledge. And then only when God encloses himself and allows himself to be contained, because again, a keli has to contain it. Then he gets in within himself the Torah, the descriptions of chesed, chachma, etc. Shenikra chacham. Then you could call him that God's chacham. Mitzad hislap shusi, because he enclosed himself in the keli of chachma. As Elijah again says in this very difficult piece of Zohar that we talk about on Erev Shabbos, An Chakim, that you are wise, Pirish, Shemisaper Be'an Vesanusai, that Elijah the prophet is describing God's humility, Shemash V'Latzmi, that he lowers himself, Lihislavish Be'bechinas Kli HaChachma, to clothe himself in the vessel, which defines Chachma, wisdom. Again, because God is pshitus, is simplicity. But when he goes into the vessel of Chachma, then he acquires the title, so to say, of Chachma, not in a way that we understand, because it says not b'Chachma Yedi, not in a way that we understand, but still a description of Chachma. Although to describe God and to limit God in the description of a Chacham is way beyond Ein Aroich, can't be comparison to the simplicity. By definition, again, simplicity is not just higher. Simplicity, by definition, is simple, has no definition. So you have to imagine, to go from being undefined, pashut, to being defined is totally a change. It's totally bein aroich from having, like to say someone's smarter or kinder. So that's within the definition of kindness, to be kinder or smarter. But to be beyond the description of chachma, that's out of our comprehension. So too, He enclothes himself, lislabish b'chinas chesed, to the definition of kindness. V'nikra as a gadol, then he's called great, gadol Hashem. Gadol is the definition of kind, or chassid, or he's a pious. That's why when you say you see greatness in God, that's him humbling himself, not just to be recognized as great, but to be defined as great. Shaidei anova, through humility, v'hashpala, and to lower himself. Shehishbas asmin lislabish mitzvah chesed, and clothe himself in the vessel that defines chesed. Az daike shaykh likras God, then you become great. Ma'ashenke muhuse vatzmusei merumim meged zekanal. But the essence of God is way beyond any of this description. We're just going to learn it the way it is simple in this Maamar. And I'm going to say the word simple, God forbid, but this concept gets chewed over deeper over the years in the Maamarim of what's the definition of pshitos, what's the definition of the Eses Sphere Sagnuzas, which is a very hard concept, the hidden 10 attributes. Is there some sort of character of light? Like we say in the Neshama, right? We say that the Neshama has a power to listen and a power to see. That power to see is simplistic because in the soul you don't see it, but when it encloses itself, it means the way that the soul sees is different. And also we have to remember something else, that this is a side point that sometimes I think gets lost in translation, which that is that when we talk about the simplistic of the soul, like Chayani Shamaditi Lefanav, that the soul stood before God, or we talk about the soul as after the passing of a person in the Garden of Eden, it's not the same soul. The soul in the Garden of Eden is still the character of the person. It's just without the body. But the soul before it comes down to this world is the simplistic of the soul. So you have to understand, like when we talk about like the soul sees, or the whispering of the souls that we have in the Talmud, so all kind of connected to as the person was, just without the body. But the souls that Elijah says, Chai Hashem Shamaditi, I stood before God with movement. That's obviously a level of soul that's so when we say seeing and listening, that that could be the way the soul comes out of the body, but once it was already in the body. So but when the soul goes into the body, and it's the power to see that goes into vision, and it's the power to listen that goes into the ears. So there has to be in the soul the definition of seeing and hearing. So that's kind of similar to the idea of Eses Sphere Sagnuzas, but we're not going to go into that question, the hidden character of the light before it goes into the vessel. Okay, but nevertheless, and once it goes into the vessel, then it's a humility for God to be called great. Only when he goes into the vessels that defines and holds the light to give it the character. And that's also why we talk about in the Pardes that's mentioned many times that we mentioned from the Alter Rebbe and the Baal Shem Tov and others about that we daven loy v'loy l'midaisa, we daven to him, not to his attributes. Who's him? Is him the light that goes into the vessels? Is him the vessels that are the power that defines the vessels? So these are all the questions that come around the question of the pshitas of God, the simplistic of God, and how he goes into the vessels. Okay. When we say that God has names, so what is the name? The name is obviously not the Or. It's not the Ein Sof, the infinite light, the infinite. Because you have to remember there's the infinite light and there's the infinite. Those are also not the same thing. The infinite light is the light that comes from God's Ein Sof. There's the Maamar, the source of light, and there's the light. So there's also a light that's infinite, and that light that's infinite, the Or Ein Sof, goes into the Kalim. But that's still not the Ein Sof itself. So what does it mean then when we give God names? Those are the Kalim. When the light goes into the vessel gives it the character. Each Keli has its name and character and style. And what is it? Is it an emotion or intellect? The Esosphere is the Atzilus of the 10 attributes in Atzilus. Each is of its own vessel. Now, again, we've learned that the vessels, the difference in the world of tikkun, of fixing, and the world of chaos is that the world of fixing, the vessels are not separate. They coexist. They're made up of characters. They're not defined, each one only Chacham. It's Chacham how it has the 10 characters of the other 9 characters of the attributes. So there's a kindness in Chesed where a person understands you have to be kind. It's not the raw intellect. Shemislavish bem Orein Sof, that the Orein Sof, again, the infinite, the light of the infinite, not the Ein Sof itself. The Ein Sof itself obviously doesn't enclose itself in anything. The Orein Sof, the light that comes from the Ein Sof, Baruch Hu u'misyach dimam, when it becomes one, like a content that goes into a vessel, or even more so, because the content and the vessel are still separate. There's the liquid, let's say, and then there's a vessel, but it's like the neshama and the body, kind of, which we give, that becomes one character, with an absolute oneness between the content that's in the vessel, the Or Ein Sof and the vessel. That's what we say about in the world of Atzilus, that he and his vessels are one. Then you have a name of Kel. That's God defined as kind. The name Kel is Chesed. That's when God gets the name Kel, is when the Or Ein Sof goes into the Kli of Chesed in Atzilus, and it becomes a Yichud Gomer, not like liquid in a cup, that the liquid could be poured out, but it becomes a Yichud Gomer, Iu v'gamei Chad. He is one with his vessels. V'shem Elikim, and what does it mean, the name Elikim? V'chines Kli HaGvura. That's when the Or Ein Sof, the infinite light, goes into the vessel of Gvura, severity. That's why in Elikim there's din, judgment. V'shem Adnai, when we say God's name Adnai, Lord or Master, is Malchus, is kingship. That's an Adnai, is like a king. Omnam Shem Havai, that's all. So now we ask we're answering the third question really, together with the second question of what are the names of God and what's unique about the name of Havaya Yud Kei Vav Kei. So then other names that are not Yud Kei Vav Kei are the Kelim and the light that become one, and this becomes the character or the name of Kel, or the name Elikim, or the name of Adonai. Omnam Shem Havai, what's the name Yud Kei Vav Kei? Hu apnimis shel Hashem l'shem hakelim. It is that inner light. The inner light, the Or Ein Sof that goes into the vessel, that becomes one with the vessel. When it goes into it, that energy, the part that goes into it, let's say, right? So that goes into and becomes one with the vessel. What is the light itself? The Or Ein Sof, that is the Shem Havai Yud Kei Vav Kei. So the name of names is Yud Kei Vav Kei. It's the light that goes into the vessel. That is the light that goes into the vessels. What light went into the vessel of Chesed that became Kel is the Havaya, the Or Ein Sof. So the Yud Kei Vav Kei is the name is the name that's given to the Or Ein Sof, to the infinite light, versus the name Kel, which is how the light connects to the vessel of Chesed. Now we have a title that's the name itself, and that is the name of Teferes, Yud Kei Vav Kei itself, which would be like when we talk about lights versus liquids. So lights, for instance, the example of when we were growing up in yeshiva as kids, would be like holiday lights, right? When you have the glass that is red, green, what have you, what different colors. So the light itself is the light that's inside the bulb. So the light that comes out of the bulb of a red bulb will be red light. But it's not that the light is really red. It's just that when the coming out of the red bulb becomes red. It's not exactly a perfect example, but gives us a kind of an understanding of how the keli, the vessel, affects the light. Whereas if you have a clear light, a clear bulb, right, a glass clear bulb, then the light is the light. It has no color. And that's like the Shem Havaya in the name of Havaya, which would be in the Teferes. Okay. The Hainu b'chinas Kel, but then it goes into Chesed, it's the Shem Kel. Shu Hashem shebekli Chesed. That's the name. That's when the Chesed, when the Or Ein Sof connects with the attribute of Chesed. And again, you have to remember, there's a big principle here. Iu v'gamei Echad. He and his vessels become one. That's the Chiddush over here, because this is how we bring it into Tzevakos. That God becomes now. It's not a liquid, so to say, in a vessel. It's now him and the vessel become one. It's one entity. Almost like the idea of a neshama and a guf, where the person himself or herself is that person which is the soul and body together. But even there it's separated a little bit. So he says, so the Havaya is the Or Ein Sof, the infinite light that emanates from the Ein Sof, from the infinite, to go into the definition of the vessel. So what's the obvious question? Who makes the vessels? Right? If the Or Ein Sof, we've done this Maamar so many times, so we could ask a few more questions than we would typically ask in a difficult Maamar like this. But the obvious question would be, so who makes the vessels? Right? The vessels, if a vessel could contain and define something, it has to be coming from even a stronger power, because something that could control something has to be stronger than the thing being controlled. The example I like to give is something that I'm a little familiar with, is how you make aluminum, like profiles, extrusions. That in order to make an extrusion, you have to have a steel die. The steel metal is stronger than the aluminum. And if you heat up the aluminum to an extreme heat and it becomes almost like a very hot putty, and you put it through an extrusion press, and you put a die with a shape cut out in it, it's going to push through a shape of the extrusion shape that's defined by the die. But what's one of the conditions? The die has to be stronger than the aluminum, which is the steel has to be stronger than the aluminum, not just because it's not been heated up, but it has to be able to hold shape. So the same thing over here. The keli has to be stronger than the or in order to define it. So who makes the keli? And that's the question of loyal v'loyal midaisav. That's what the Baal Shem Tov teaches. That when you think about loy v'loy midaisav, you have to pray to Yid, him, and not to his attributes. Him means that energy, that godliness that created the vessel. God himself has to create the vessel without being defined by that creation, and then put his light through that vessel that gets defined by that creation, so to say. And that's what it means. Don't forget that the vessel itself is not its own mitzias, it's not its own entity. You have to be mispal loy to the power that created the vessel, v'loy l'midaisav, not to the vessel, not to the attribute that comes out of the vessel. And Alter Rebbe went a step further from the Baal Shem Tov and says, why do you have to talk about the energy that made the vessel? Talk about him himself. The pshitas, atzmus alein, the God in the mind of a child. Right, a child doesn't know anything that we're just talking about. You can't start telling children about names and vessels and ors and lights and powers that make lights and etc. and the kalim. A child knows when he says the Eibishter God is the God. It's God. There's no definition. That pshitus, the simplistic that a child has of what is God, that is the essence of really what God is. Atzmus, right? That's what the child connects to, and that's loy liv loy midaisav. Don't forget to pray to the essence. But either way, that's another subject. Okay, Amram Shem Havaya. So that's the kli. Nimshach hu b'chinas Shem Havaya. So what is the orange, the light of the orange soif that goes into the keli? Hu b'chinas Shem Havaya. That is the level of Havaya. Lechein gam b'chinas Shem Elikim. The same thing applies to Elikim. Shebekli Gvura, the vessel of Gvura, defines the character of Gvura, of din, judgment. Mislabish b'tech Shem Havaya. When you put the light inside, like I said, the example, for instance, of the holiday lights. So Shu b'chinas orange soif mislabish b'tech keli, and now the infinite light goes into this specific vessel of the name Elikim. There gives that the character of Elikim. And this applies to all the names of God. That in the character, as we understand it, of Chesed, Gvura, the character that we give to God in these names is the vessel. And Yudke Vavke is the name, is the light, so to say, that goes into the keli, into the vessel. That's what we find. That the name Yud Kei Vav Kei goes with all the names. Like it says, B'yem Aseis Havaya Elikim. What does it mean? The day that Havaya Elikim made Eretz V'Shamayim, heaven and earth, that the Or, Ein Sof, the Or of the infinite light that goes into the vessel of Elikim, that's because Elikim is limitations, the world is a creation of limitations, space and time. Therefore, Havaya that goes into Elikim, that's contained, creates a containment of Eretz V'Shamayim, heaven and earth. And it says Havaya, it's a Tzevaos, which we're going to learn what that means, Lord of hosts. So there's also a kli called hosts, which is a very difficult thing to understand, which we're going to try to understand this year a little better. And that's the Havaya that goes into Tzevaos, into hosts. Because the Shem Havaya is what's bringing. Now here, he says, just to be a little more medayik, before he said that the actual light that comes from the infinite, blessed be he, that encloses itself into the vessel, that is Shem Havaya. Here he says that what is Shem Havaya? It's a mamshech or insof. It's so to say, it's not the infinite light itself. It's the power that brings the infinite light, to go into Elikim Utzavakis. So kind of we have to elaborate a bit on that when we have time. Shem HaKelim, Shua Memutze bein Oris v'Kelim. That here he calls it a memutze. That Elikim is not the light itself, but it's the in between. It's the energy that pulls the light to go into the vessel. So we could say that in the second statement over here, this is just my thinking. The second, and I have no basis for this, that the second statement over here is really explaining the statement before. That we said before, that Havaya is the Or Ein Sof, means to say that it's Mamshech the Or Ein Sof, it brings the infinite light. Okay, possibly that's what he means. V'hine, the Rebbe continues. It says like this, Zeh Shmi La'olam, this is my name forever. Zeh Zichrin, this is my memory. This is what I should be known for. Pirish b'tikun Zar, Shmi, the letter Shmi, which makes up the number value of 350, right? Shin is 300, Mem is 40, and Yud is 10. So together it makes up the number value of 350. Shmi means my name. If you add to that the first two letters of God's name, which is Yud K, which is 15, So 350 plus 15 is 365, which is Shisa, the 365 Loisase prohibitions in Torah. Zichri, the name, the calling, this is my memory, so to say, so is the number value of 237, right? 237 because the resh is 200, the yud is 10, the chaf is 20, so that's 230 plus the zayin is 7. You add to that 7, vav k, which is vav is 6 and hey is 5 is 11. Makes together 11 and 2 7 and 260 237 and 11 is 248, which is the 248 mitzvahs asay positive commandments. So what do we see from this? That's why it's called Torah Zavaya, a mitzvah Zavaya. Why is the Torah a mitzvah called Havaya? Because it's all in the name. 365 prohibitions and 248 positive commandments, which makes up the 630 mitzvahs, are all within the name of Yud Kei Vav Kei. Because Yud Kei Vav Kei, the 15 of Yud Kei and the 11 of Vav Kei together with Shmi and Zichri make up altogether the total number of 613. Why? Because it's within the Havaya that goes into the Kalim. So the Havaya in the Kalim means that the Chesed, which is basically the positive commandments, comes from the attribute of Chesed and basically proactive doing. That's from the attribute of Chesed in Zer Anpin, the small complexion, meaning in Natzilas. Vishasan, the 365, which prohibitions is in the name of Gvura. Loisase, which is the prohibitions, that's in the Gvura of Atzilus. And that's why it's called Torah Savai, because when Yud Kei Vav Kei goes into the vessels, so therefore, because in general, a prohibition demands restraining yourself, judgment calls on yourself. That's why it's in the name of Elikim, it's in the name of Gvura. And the attribute of Chesed, which is positive commandments, proactive, that's the positive commandments. And therefore, in the mitzvahs themselves, which means the laws, have in it the prohibitions, what's permitted and what's prohibited. What's kosher, what's permissible, what's possible, what's not permissible. When a person is chayiv, found obligated, when is a person zakai, find that he or she has been innocent. When something is permissible or kosher or zakai, that comes from chesed. Chesed sees the positive. So why do you get punished when you do a prohibition? Because the name of the source where the prohibitions are is in the name of Elikim, which is the name of judgment. So when you do a prohibition, when you transgress a prohibition, you're bringing upon yourself the name of judgment. And it's like we said before, the infinite light that goes into these kelim, and therefore it's called mitzvah savai, because it becomes one. Like we said, God is one with his vessels, and therefore it's the havaya. So to say, that's the, what does that mean? It means that and here we see what it means that God and his vessels are one. Because if the mitzvahs, the 613 commandments, are called mitzvahs avaya, the commandments, the rotzin, what does it mean? It's the rotzin of the Yud Kei Vav Kei, of the name of the Or Ein Sof, of the infinite light, or the power that's mamshech the Or Ein Sof, that's bringing down the infinite light, and it has different characters, the mitzvahs. There's different categories. There's positive and negative. There's things that are chayiv and things that are zakai. You have kosher and you have treif, non-kosher. So where do these? And these are character differences. This comes from midos. Why? It's because the havaya becomes one with the vessels, and therefore the mitzvahs, the rotzin, what God wants us to do in this world, gets defined by the characters. Like the light gets defined by the midos. And this is what we'll understand. That's why up until the life of Chana, which was at the tail end of the era of the judges, right? Because with her son, we went into the era of the prophets and the kings. So up until the time of Chana, there was never mention of the name Tzevaos. Rak Shem Havaya Levade. They only had Havaya and on its own, without Tzevaos. Rak Chana Amar Hashem Tzevaos. Chana added a new thing, Lord of hosts. Why? So he explains, the Rebbe. Moshe brought down the Torah. Again, what was the Torah, which has in it the characters, a positive and negative? the attribute which are broken down based on the attributes, the positive commandments and the prohibition, means to say that Moshe brought down the Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, which is the Ratzon of Hashem, the will of Hashem, into the vessels. Therefore, there's positive and negative in the Torah mitzvahs. And that's how that was enough. That was Yud-Kei Vav-Kei in the vessels of Chesed and Gvura. That's what Torah is. And that's why we have things that you should be doing and shouldn't be doing. The very fact that we're making choices or we're being told what we can and cannot do is how the Or Ein Sof connects to these definitions of positive and negative. And that was his level. He was in the world of Atzilus. That's something we'll move on from that last statement. But Moshe Rabbeinu didn't bring godliness further into Biyah. This is where things get a little complicated. Why? Why do I say complicated? Because up until what we learned until now, what we've been saying is that God is pshitus, is simplistic. So if God is simplistic, there's no definition. The fact that we have definitions of God is great, or God is kale, or kind, or compassionate, and Torah mitzvahs that are the mitzvahs of God, that the way they themselves get characters, positive commandments, negative commandments, kosher, pas, treif, chayiv, zakai, muter, osir, all those definitions of yes, no, basically, or how, goes into the way the Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, the simplistic, gets into the character, and it becomes one with the character. Now the question is, so that makes sense. So God, so to say, it's like this body and the soul. That we could wrap our heads around that, even if we don't understand it. But this is God. When you say, this is my God, this is my God. But now Chana goes, no, that's not enough. We have to bring God even into the place of separation, where he doesn't become one so much. There is different ideas here. There's angels. There's the characters start to split off even more. And Chana wants to bring that becomes one with godliness. Not only is it a new idea, it's a dangerous idea. The angel says there's things that are going out. God gets personal, right? The fact that the admonishment of the prophets is personal, that kind of language is how God is being lowered even to a personal space. And that's kind of a dangerous space, but she needed it. She says otherwise. Chana understood that they were at a pivotal moment in Jewish history. That had she not continued to bring God into even a more defined space in the world of Bria, which is almost dangerous ground, then there would be no connection between God and the people. God would be too elevated. Moshe Rabbeinu was in an elevated state, but the Jewish people were too materialistic to connect to that. So she says, if the people are too materialistic to connect to that, we have to bring God into that space, into that language, into that jargon. It's a very dangerous exercise that she did. And God appreciated it. God says, because you did that, your son is going to start off with Hashem Tzvaos. We see the greatness of Chana. That's what we talk about, the great woman. The Chana was able to make that move. That's tremendous. That's one of the most pivotal moves of our history. She brought down that just like God could become one with the vessels of Atzilus, so too he could become one with the vessels of Bria. And Bria is already separation. So too God become one with the vessels in the worlds of Bria, Yitziah, Asiyah, creation, formation, and action. So Moshe never did that. It wasn't necessary because he had to bring down the mitzvahs, and the mitzvahs were able to come into the world of Atzilus, which there got the definition of kosher puzzle, yes, no. He was able to bring the Torah as it was in Atzilus to the Jewish people, and that spoke to them. They connected to that. And he was able to connect, like we said, that the light and the vessels become mamish one. There are definitions, there are entities, but God is not one with the vessels of Bria. That's what I'm saying. It's an extremely dangerous path that Chana took. But the prophets after Moshe, starting the ages of the prophets, which Chana opened that time with her son Samuel. They brought God to become one with the vessels of Bria Yitziah. Now, if you have to remember something, right? Where does Alter Rebbe is going to end off? Where did she get the possibility to do that? Is because at the end of the day, everything's godliness. The idea that if we look at things from Yosher, from straight, wow, how could you bring God all the way down to Bria? But if you look at things in circular, in the Makif, everything is godliness. There's no real difference between Yitzir, Asiyah, and Atzilus. It's just how God shows to show high levels of godliness, awareness, and Gili and revelation. She's able to bring in what's defined as a less revealed place to reveal godliness in that space. But then she had to do that. That's why Chana was the first to introduce Lord of Hosts. Because what's host? Host is plural. Everyone followed her. All the prophets followed her. Tzevake starts how Yudke Vavke goes not just in the world, becomes one with the it's almost the infinite of Atzilus, but into the world of separation. The Imam Gamkein Kamoishis Bari Matzshem also become one with the separate ideas, as will be explained. First, the Rebbe says she needed to do that. Why? Because in the days of Moshe, he was prophesying. The whole connection of godliness was the Jewish people were listening and were able to relate to the prophecy coming from the world of Atzilus. Therefore, they were able to do Torah Hashem the way it was in the world of Atzilus. And that's how God communicated to Moshe. And the Jewish people performed the Torah accordingly. As time moved on, and there's Yeridus Hadoros, and there's a descent of the generations. They're no longer doing what Hashem wanted. It was a foreign concept to them. And the prophets had to admonish the people. What's the difference when anyone says to someone, what are you doing? Or if a prophet says it? When the prophet says it, it's not the prophet talking. It's God speaking through the prophet. So who's the one who's admonishing? God is admonishing. That's why it's called a prophet. It wasn't enough. The people weren't relating to godliness as it was in the world of Atzilus. They had to come further into their space of Bria and separation. That the Jewish people should listen and be able to relate. Again, it's not a compromise on Torah, God forbid, in no way. Nothing changed in the 630 mitzvahs. Again, like I said, this is not an easy concept to understand, and I'm not sure I'm the one to explain it. But we're learning a Maamar together, and therefore, so nothing changed in the laws itself. It's not the laws. There was a broadening of laws, maybe a greater understanding or articulation of the laws as time went on. Of course, the mission of the Talmud, the responsa, etc., the Shulchan Aruch, but nothing changed in the Torah Hashem. We don't add anything, but she's bringing it more into in a relatable way that the Jewish people can understand, especially in the Teichacha, in the admonishment. When the prophet says something, people understand what the prophet's saying. When the prophet's talking spiritual, it doesn't talk to them. The way if things would remain the way they were in the days of Moshe. The Jewish people in the further generations, in the generations of the prophets after Moshe, were not connecting to that. Was too high for them. Torah and the people were separate. Therefore, we had to bring it into a relatable language. It's the language spoke, not the Torah. It's changed into the world of Bria. And therefore, God was able to speak in a language that the people understood. God spoke in the reality of the people, in the language of the people through the prophets, in a language that he didn't speak in the days of Moshe Rabbeinu. Which is an amazing thing if you think about it, because if you hear this is the idea what it means, the paradise of Torah, the orchard of Torah. What does it mean, the orchard of Torah? It doesn't mean that you open up a subject and you say, okay, this is a simplistic way of understanding the subject. And now if I study it in the Derech HaRemez, this is the hint of what the Torah means to say. And then you have the Drush, this is the Drasha. And then you have the Sod, the secret, that's the foundation of what this story means. But when you see the story, the Alter Rebbe is putting here, the story here, means you open up the book of Shmuel, and you were to read what the story of Chana, you'd say, I don't see any of what you're talking about in the story. The story is Chana wanted a child, and she prayed to God. But the Alter Rebbe is showing that Chana had a greater awareness and mission here, just beyond wanting to have a child. Having a child to her meant having a special child. She said in her prayer, he's going to be dedicated to God because he has a mission. And she started his mission for him. She says Chana also chose for him that he should be a Nazareth. Shmuel was a Nazareth. Who decided that? His mother, Chana. And there's a whole other question if she's allowed to give him that responsibility to be a Nazir, whether he had accepted himself or his father had to confirm Elkanah. But we heard that when you read it in the story, in Sod, how the Alter Rebbe opens up the story, that her desire for children was not just to have a child, but why she wanted a child, what she wanted with the child. And she understood that he was the person to start to go to lead the Jewish people into this new era, the era of the prophets and the kings. With it came the idea of bringing godliness down to the name of Tzvaos. Although a prophet can introduce anything new, how could she introduce a new idea? It's not, God forbid, that she's adding anything to the Torah Moshe. It's bringing Torah down, not adding anything to Torah. We didn't compromise in one of the 630 mitzvahs or any of the sub of the chumras or the way to do the mitzvahs. Nothing changed in the mitzvahs, but just brought it down. The mitzvahs, the way it connects to the Yud Kei Vav Kei into the Kelim Vatzilas, the way it connects into the world of Bria. That's why the name hosts is mentioned by the Nevi'im. Tzvakas means regiments, soldiers. These are the regiments of the souls and the angels in the world of Bria. Asher all of a sudden becomes plural. It's chayoles, tzvakos is plural. From the oneness of the world of Atzilus, there's many regiments that you can't even count. And these are creations, not one. And the creations are not godliness. They're godly, they're angels, they're souls, but they're not God. Like in the world of Atzilus, that the vessels become one actually with God. They were able to connect. She was meaning what she introduced was to be able to connect something that's seemingly separate with God. Again, like I said, a very dangerous exercise. Just the way God becomes one with the vessels of Atzilus. Just like we say God is one with his vessels in the world of Atzilus, which is all godly, so too God is able to become one with seemingly separation in the world of Bria. All these angels. These are Tzevakos, God. It's the name of God himself. He himself is these hosts. Just like he's one in the world of Atzilus, he becomes one with the Tzevakos, which we say Malachim and Neshamas. So too he becomes one with the vessels in the world of Bri Yitziasi and the world of separation. He himself is the Lord, is the hosts, the Lord of hosts. He is that. Just like the Kalim, just like Kel is the God of kindness, so to say, is the Torah, the description of God as kind. And this doesn't mean to say that they're separate and nullified to God. To become one with God. Nullified means that you're something, but you're nullified. Here's your mamish become one. Just like the soul becomes one with the body, so too. So say God came one with the message of the Tzevakos, or the name of Tzevakos. And it was able to come out in the Techacha. You saw it in the conversation, in the language that the prophet was speaking, that seemed much less godly than what we were used to in the days of Moshe, much less elevated and much more in like the jargon of the time. Shagam shaguf hu akli va'ikri neshama. Even though the vessel, the body is also just a vessel, and the neshama is the character or the definition. You become one. You don't say, "Oh, this is me and my body." This is me. I say hello to me and my soul. This is me. Shenikra Adam, that is the person, the body and the soul. And the Neshama Shibiguf, the soul and the body together. The body doesn't have its own name. Like it says, like you have a turtle. The turtle's shell and body is one. So too, this is the description given to how the soul and the body is one. And so too, that's how God became one with Tzevakos within the world of Bria. Again, a very hard subject. Leaves a lot of space for confusion and misinterpretation. The Rebbe gives an example. For instance, like you were to call a person Shalom and Chachma that studied Chachma Shem Chacham, right? So we don't. I mean, some people would like to use the name title of a smart person because you can study, but that's maybe what people say. You're not going to call someone a chacham because they can study. You'll say you can be a chacham if you did study. But in order to become a chacham, you have to study. So the chachma is the knowledge, is the information. The chacham is the person who's smart enough that could become one with that information. And that's when that person becomes a chacham. Before the person studied it. It was a study before. It was a book on the shelf. It was an idea that existed. You didn't create the idea. Adam Shalom is separate from the person who studied it. Before the person studied it, the person had no connection. It was a separate entity from that wisdom, that idea. However, when the person studied the subject and now masters the subject in all angles, knows it through and through, now the person becomes a chacham. Why? Because the chacham and the person become one. Now the description is you are a chacham. Why? Because the person who didn't know the knowledge before and the knowledge that was separate before become one. And not only that, even though that you have the Taim of Chacham, doesn't mean you own the Chacham. Doesn't mean that if someone else were to know that information, you become less of a Chacham. You could say that you're less impressive as a Chacham, because now you're not the only person who knows it. It doesn't make you less smart because someone else knows something. It just makes you less unique, possibly. So too above. Even though they're like a separate entity, like the person who's separate, which are whether they're souls or creations or angels, they're nullified to God. When the prophets brought godliness into the creations of Bria, just like it becomes one with the vessels of Atzilus, God is the Lord of hosts. To the description of God. Is not separate from them. Orin Seif became Datzilus in Cain, Kadeshi Yamsh is Mashech, Orin Seif Bibia, who Aideshem Avaya Betchila, Vizah Avaya Tzavakis. Again, just like Avaya brings godliness down into the vessels of Atzilus, like we said, it's Mamshech, the Orin Seif, so too here. It's not that a lower level of God. It's the same Havaya that goes even further down and brings the infinite light into Tzavakis, into the hosts. What does it mean tangibly? What does it mean actually? That God connected to the Tzavakis, that God speaks through the prophets that are seemingly human, and he speaks ideas that are human ideas. And it's God talking. Seemingly you see it's beneath him to talk like that. But he lowered himself into that conversation, so there should be a relay that the people could relate to Hashem. It was the way God was in that space. It's not that the Navi was able to prophesize from a light that's beyond his space or her space. There were women prophets as well. But in order that it's from their space, from their makeup, right? We talk about Yecheskel on his level, Yeshaya on his level, was able to talk to prophecy. And Yisrael, that's God speaking himself through the prophets to admonish the Jewish people. It's not like the prophet is saying an idea independently from God. Then it would just be a person admonishing. It's God speaking himself through the prophet. He says, how could you do that? How could you bring that down? That God is connected to the world of Atzilus, where it's all godly, is one thing. How could you bring God into a space of separation he says they're brias, they're creations, because it doesn't come from the kav, the direct line. It comes from the eagle, the circular. What's it mean, the circular? Everything is godliness, and the bigger picture. The way God encompasses the world. There's no difference between light and dark. Space, the world of Bria is different. It's no different than the world of Atzilus from the infinite, from the perspective of the infinite. It's all a creation. God could be equally large and small. Because from the place of the circular, God could go into any space. Any space is not godliness, and no space is limited to be separate from godliness. Because at the essence, it's all equal. It's all, even from the lower places, and in the world of creation, it's all the same. Let's skip this is actually an important footnote. That's why it says Bachana when she introduced this idea. It says about her prayer, Veispal al Havaya. She went al Havaya. Al Havaya means above Havaya. V'toim Havaya Tzevaos, then she said, Lord of hosts. In order for her to bring godliness and become one with Tzevaos, the host, she had to go beyond the norm, to go al. The Hashem Havaya until this point was only Mamshech, bringing the infinite light to the Kelim Vatzilas. She had to reach beyond. Beyond Shem Havaya, as it's brought down in other places. The idea of Loiti Meshakela, the idea of, which is an idea we'll learn later in Mishpatim. Now let's go back. What's that have to do with our parsha? It's a beautiful idea, but what's that have to do with our parsha? It says, this is what it means on the essence of the day. Yatsu called Tzevaos, all the hosts. There it says Tzevakis Havaya. It doesn't say Havaya Tzevakis. When we left, what is separate Tzevakis reconnected to the essence, to Havaya. Lashon Samach Shat Tzavos Nitfal L'Shem Havaya. The host went back to the Shem Havaya, became secondary. It's not to say that God lowered himself into Tzevakos. We don't say Hashem Tzevakos left Egypt, but Tzevaos Hashem left Egypt. The Tzevaos, that's separate. The people elevated upwards to come close to Havaya. And what does this mean? Not just the people. All the avodah that we did in the 210 years in Egypt, that were elevated through the Golus, through the exile of Egypt. It all came elevated to the name of Havaya. That's what it means. The hosts went back to Havaya, which are the Rapach Netzusim, the 288 sparks that got lost in the breaking of the vessels. And out of the 288 in the years of Egypt, they were able to elevate 202 of those sparks, leaving, of course, 86 sparks left. That he saved Egypt. And that's what it means, Erev Rav. The Erev Rav again is 202. Oluitam, these are the sparks that manifest in the converts that went up with Moshe. Rav Lach. Upirish ve'inyan shenikr tzvakas Hashem. Why is it called tzvakas Hashem? Bechinas tav v'samach Hashem Havaya. That the sparks went up to Havaya. Ve'inyan, the idea is, because where did these sparks come from? The sparks came from the 280 sparks from broken pieces of the names of Havaya in the way it comes in the number value of 72, 63, 48, 5, 52, different ways of writing Yud Kei Vav Kei in the letters if you spell them out. Yud is Yud Vav Dal, makes up 10. So that's 10 of 80 of 72, etc. Hey is 2 Heys is 10. Hey Yud could be Hey Yud is 15, etc. Like when they got elevated, the broken pieces of God's name came back. The Tzevakis, this host that was separate, went back to Havaya. They don't get any names because they go back to the source. Therefore, they have no name. They call it Tzevakis Hashem. He gives an example. When a person thinks about and contemplates the greatness of God. When a person thinks about God, so then you're still a Metzias, you're someone. But when you totally nullify yourself, it's not that you understand something. If you have a feeling, it means that the thinking of godliness gets defined by you. You feel. But when you get totally bottled, it's not any feeling of yours, then it's almost like, as if you become one with God. These sparks, that fell in the breaking, they have names. That's only when they're separate. Like a person who has an identity, that's my name, to speak to someone else. But when the person's alone, you don't need a name. The only people call you with a name. But when the sparks come back to the source, they have no name. Now they're just the sparks back to their source. They have no separate name. The Tzevaos that were separate come back to Havaya. And that's the sparks. What does it have to do with the Jewish people? So the Rebbe finishes off the Maamar. On their measurements. Here the Rebbe finishes off that you should know that the Jewish people themselves, they're the ones who do the avodah, but they themselves are much greater than the sparks that they rescue and take out of Egypt. Okay, again, a very, very complicated concept. Not that we're any smarter than they were from the years before, but Baruch Hashem, we got through the Maamar again. Laila Tov and Chodesh Tov, everyone. Thank you for joining.